Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. This is our final installment of Conversations on Photography for the fall season. I can't believe we were just talking earlier with Pavel about how just the weeks have been flying exceptionally fast. I know that we always say that, but it just seems especially true this autumn. I'm especially delighted to have Pavel Romaniko with us today. Before I introduce him, I'm just going to say a few words. We noticed that it's so wonderful that every time we have one of these, an installment of Conversations on Photography, we seem to always get a lot of new people that either don't know Project Save very well or kind of have brand new to Project Save. So I'll just say a few quick words and then we'll move on to the presentation. My name is Arto Vaughn. I'm the Executive Director of Project Save Photograph Archives. Project Save was founded in 1975 by Ruth Tomasian. And it has become, over these decades, it's the oldest and largest archive of original hard copy photographs from the global Armenian experience. What that means is that it's not a digital archive, although obviously we digitize the material, but it's not a digital archive, it's a physical archive of over around 80,000 photographs. We have photographs, we have collections from places such as Japan to, of course, the New England area where we're based, to Cuba, Argentina, Egypt, California, Canada, Brazil, France, you name it. It's an incredibly rich and diverse archive of photographs ranging from the 1870s to the present day. So at this point, I'm very proud and very pleased to say that all the hard work, all these decades that's gone into Project Save, it's not only an incredibly, just a priceless wealth of documents in the Armenian cultural space, but at this point, it's really an important photography archive in and of itself in North America. It's become an important photography archive, which is saying a lot. As part of the new initiatives that we had this past year, Conversations on Photography being one of the first, we started last year. We've already had a number of these wonderful events. It's been a great reaction, which we're so grateful for, to everybody from around the world who joins us for these events. And I'm especially happy that this particular one, our finale for the fall season, is with our first artist in residence. And I'm just so excited about that. That was one of the first things I wanted to do when I joined Project Save as executive director. You know, we believe very strongly that this is a living archive. And as part of that, I felt that this is a really untapped potential for not just researchers and educators, but really for artists, for all sorts of creative people to explore the archive and bring these incredible images to life, and to filter them through their own lenses, whether they be photographers, as in Pavel's case, a photographer and an artist, musicians, sculptors, animators, you name it. And I couldn't be more pleased that our inaugural artist in residence was exactly the kind of artist and person and thoughtful intellectual as Pavel Romaniko, who I will introduce right now. Pavel Romaniko is a faculty member at University of Massachusetts at Lowell, where he teaches in the art and design department. He came to the United States as a teenager from Pereslav, Russia. He studied at studio arts at Northwestern College in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he received his Bachelor's of Arts. And he received an MFA in Imaging Arts from the Rochester Institute of Technology. as you'll see, Pavel's work is quite evocative. There's a lot of subtlety, a lot of finesse, a lot of interesting tensions. It combines photography, it combines kind of installment work and other types of creative work that he does. I'm going to leave that to him to talk about. But we really couldn't be more pleased. He's been with us at Project Save, coming into the archive, spending time here since September. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome him today to talk with us. So I'll hand it over to Pavel Romaniko. Thank you, Pavel.
Thank you, Ardo. It's gonna sort of set a timer for myself, but thank you very much. I think you're very generous with your comments. I would hardly call myself an intellectual, and but I'll just keep that as a sort of a shield. So, but yes, thank you everybody for being here, and I'm honored to do this, even even I'm still not sort of after 3 months, I'm not quite clear about what exactly sort of I am doing here, and that's in a good way. Maybe that's sort of a sense of mystery and discovery. That's what keeps me challenged. But yeah, I just want to start actually by thanking Ardo, Marta, and Margaret for this opportunity. I mean, when Ardo invited me to the archive, and I took it as a wonderful challenge, and I truly feel honored. And Marta and Margaret were very helpful to me with whatever I have needed, helping me sort of find related information, find images, scan them, and so on and so forth. So hopefully I haven't been too needy, but I'm going to talk about a few ideas, and I guess I should start my presentation here so everybody can see. I apologize ahead of time if this, oh, that is not what I wanted to be. If this presentation seems more as sort of a co-joined set of ideas than a cohesive whole, but hopefully something will come out of it. Yeah, I mean, in my early stages, as I tried sort of, as I started working as an artist, or I should say, as I started as a resident, right, as an artist in residence, I tried a number of approaches. I arrived to the archive, and I sort of realized myself, I was immediately perplexed at my lack of knowledge and understanding of Armenian culture, even though having grown up in Soviet Union and obviously sort of connected indirectly to that experience, I knew nothing. I mean, I had a set of cliches. I knew about Armenian genocide, the Stalin's Great Purge, and its sort of a devastating impact on Armenian intellectuals in 1936, 38. Because I was already conscious enough, sort of I was 8 years old when a terrible earthquake in Spitak happened in 1988. I remember that. Of course, I know of Kardashians, and most definitely, as somebody who studied photography, I know Yusuf Karsh, right, a Canadian Armenian, probably one of the more recognized photographers, modernist photographers in the 20th century. But I really sort of struggled to find any connections outside of these sort of surface concepts. And I was fearful to engage with some of these narratives that are not familiar to me or comment on a culture that is obviously not my own. So that's why I chatted with Zardo about it, and I expressed my concerns right away. And that's why I think when I finally sort of decided on some things that I'm going to do with the archive or in the archive, I'm going to try to sort of approach it as more of an archive. I'm going to look at photographs, and I'm going to see sort of what connections I can make and what can I actually learn from it, right? Again, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a researcher or writer. I mean, I'm an artist, and I often work from association, even though I do a lot of research because I produce certain work, but nevertheless, sort of hear some sort of thoughts and my experience with the archive. To me, even though the archive was connected to a single culture, again, as I mentioned, I really wanted a very complex culture with tragic and very complicated history, and also a history full of triumphs and obviously very wonderful things, and they're all reflected in this archive. And that sort of that complexity I sort of wanted to understand and explore and be, in a sense, open to. So some things that I sort of considered, and I'll run you through some approaches that I've had, but one of my early and more of a literal approach was that I really started to, randomly connecting images. And one of the first images that I actually came across was, and again, I'm going to label my methodology here is I'm just going to directly relate to the object that I saw, is this drawing of the house of a poet, of Armenian poet, Havanis, I'm going to butcher the name, but Tamanyans. And looking through the archive, I actually found the photograph of that same house, right? And which says that the house and museum. Again, it was taken a long time ago, but in a sense, I have this sort of a duality or dual representation of a single place, which to me has always been interested because my work has often connected me to history and how space is organized, especially sort of how space organized in collective memory. So this image to me was, this image came, or I came to this image much later, but to me it became sort of more representative of my experience and sort of some of the things that I am attempting to connect, and also how I understand the archive. I looked at this image as an object, and as Ardo mentioned, Project Safe is also a digital archive in addition to being archive the house as physical photographs. And I sort of, this image really opened up to me some interesting both metaphors and structural sort of my understanding of how archive structures and functions. Because essentially this image had two sides, and those two sides I really connected in an interesting ways. So what you're seeing here is a verso and recto, and the front had this portrait of two people, and the back had this, a little note or a caption, and it had a little picture of a landscape pasted on it, and it is upside down, so I'll flip it for you. But what I really saw here is the image sort of is fascinating to me because it's a metaphor of what I saw as an archive and what photographs in the archive represent to me. Multiple sets of meanings are laminated for me in this object. This image is a capsule. The two sides of the object, the attached fragmented landscape and the caption on the back, all embody a complex narrative possibility. There's a dialogue about formal properties of the photograph. There's a memory. There's a sense of forgetting, implied loss, longing, and hope, all encapsulated in one. This image, there's specificity and at the same time, none, because and I'll explain later. How do we talk about this photograph? I was wondering, how should we discuss, or should we discuss it as an object? Is it a photograph or is it both? To me, it is both. The person and the place are connected in a set of uncanny circumstance here. Who do we go for the truth? Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida called photographs unclassifiable, and I think this image represents that to me. It is at the same time connected to the referent or what is being represented, or many at the same time, it is bringing me sort of a closer to an answer about this photograph's origin. Whom does this object or photograph belong to? Who was it taken for, and who was it meant for? Now that it's in this archive and I am looking at it, it was obviously not meant for me, but that's sort of the collective the photograph acquires, especially once it's removed from its original context, and somehow acquires additional representation surrounding it, is always interesting to me. So I essentially ended up in this sort of connecting myself more and more with actually photograph as an object, as a material object, and the object that really speaks beyond just its initial what it's representing, right? Because of its both of the two sides. I started looking at someone intentionally seeking out some images that are actually fragmented, that are torn, that in a sense have something that requires the search and finding one and the other, whether it's the back or the front or one part or the other. So for example, this was another landscape that connected me to some space, again, abstract to me in so many ways, even though it has some specificity in the caption as a view of a Kurdish village. Again, the fact that it's that the terror and then this image exists in two pieces actually connected me to me more as an object than actually a photograph. This image is another sort of a image that connected me or got me thinking about this archive in a particular way on objectness, right? Where the image, as we learned from the caption, was rolled up for a long time, and the only part that survived are these two parts. So, you know, the immediate questions that sort of come to mind is where are the rest of the people? Who gets to remember them? And how do we relate to this as we're missing the you know, half or 40% of this image? I essentially and let me move on to the next one. So this was another image. So I started seeking out again this sort of trying to connect these images of landscape. I was wondering, why are these images broken? Is it just the age? Were they torn? Were they damaged in some other calamity? What exactly was happening is really unclear to me. There is no sort of a ontology to of that moment. And as you can see here, again, I connected these images just simply by sort of a wonderment, right? A sense of wonderment, because they both from a similar time and they both seem to be from a similar place, which of course holds significant context and significant sort of a historical, a lot of tragedy and and at the same time, a lot of memory. So one image is broken and the other image somebody tried to repair with, you know, with Scotch tape and some of this contemporary I guess, the contemporary mending materials. So just before I sort of continue, I'll give you a sense, I'll give you a context of my own experience of working with an archive before, which is very sort of which is seldom, but I worked with my personal archive. I sort of regularly return to some images that I have taken earlier and sometimes reconstruct them or rephotograph them, as you can see in these two images here from 2004 and 2004 and 5, a series on Russia that I made, and then a later series that I started in 2008, where I take the same image and remake it. You know, sometimes I remake or reuse parts of my existing pieces and reconstruct them into recontextualize them and present them as something else, often trying to comment on history and how space essentially embodies certain memory, certain collective experience. This image where I use public archive, in this case, the connected to Russia meddling in urine samples during the Olympics. I would take historical images or historical events and reconstruct them and rephotograph them and remake them in some instances. This image specifically, right, probably sort of has a more complex relationship to an archive in my experience. This is a photograph, a public photograph or from a public archive of a dacha where Stalin collapses and dies, where I remade the space in 2008, and that space actually eventually at some point became part of the searches, right, where you could, when searching for a nearby dacha from Kuntseva of Stalin, one could actually come up as it comes up as part of the search. So where the image that is actually sort of acquires its own life in an archive, and which I cannot really control. So here's a couple more. There's an Untitled Road 2014, Untitled TV1, where I again sort of often constructed from existing photographs or is a reconstruction of existing photographs. In this case, this is a television, which would have been a common television if it was present in the homes of people in 1953 when Crimea was gifted to Ukraine by Leonid Khrushchev. So just to return to the archive and sort of how I worked through the archive based on the experience of my own previous work, is that this was, I essentially, you know, being faced with a broad and vast volume of images, I decided that I'm going to focus on something that's familiar to me, and I looked. I asked to look at all the images that are connected to Soviet Union and and this was one of the first images that came my way, where leaders of the Communist Party were celebrating, at the celebration of 21st anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, right? And as I kept searching, I came across this image, leader of a party and government on their way to Red Square on a May event, November 1939, which reminded me of another image that I've seen previously. And that image would have been in the TASS archives, the sort of the general public archive of photographs from Soviet Russia, and actually it still exists. And there was even the number, the TASS 293342. So I decided to look it up. And when I looked up that number in that archive, all I found is this. Under that number, a very different image existed. So I kept on looking, and I finally located the image that it reminded me of, and that was the image and I found it in a book that I have actually of TASS photographs, which is actually the chairman and the Council of People's Commissars are going to a May event. And that May celebration, is, if you look at the date, is 1941. So that date is different from the image that you see in the archive, in the Project Safe archive. And even though seemingly the image is taken at the same time and in the same place, we just see in different vantage points of the same location, the same event. And if I return to this previous slide, you'll notice that the note from Project Safe mentions that the photograph appears to be doctored to place Stalin in the photograph, which is true. I mean, we can observe it, right? It's observable that the Stalin does not sort of fit neither compositionally nor sort of in terms of a vantage point. Because it is doctored, and essentially sort of doing further searching and going through other archives, I did find the image and the time from which the Stalin probably was taken, and it would have been from one of the images taken during events in this 1928 photograph, or I should say, this encounter, right? This moment in history in 1928, where Stalin is walking with Alexei Rykov, who was eventually executed, again, essentially on the orders of Stalin for his collaboration with Trotsky, or his association with Trotsky. So here's a good example of sort of how I think of images and how they find their place in my own work, is often sort of that they're constructs, and they're often constructs, especially in Soviet Union, that were created in terms of controlling both the meaning and a sense, the collective sort of a sense of memory, and an association with their own history. So just to run you through some other images, I mean, again, this is sort of an association that I was seeing in the archive. This is not from Project Safe. This is from a TASS archive. But the erasure that was happening at that time, there's an entire book, some of you may be familiar with, called The Commissar Vanishes, where the traces the history of Soviet erasure of faces. And I started finding some of the images in the Project Safe archive, where I've noticed that intentionally or not, but obviously with some kind of a I should say with some intent here, that were also either blacked out or erased from certain images. I don't know for which reasons, I don't know for what purposes, right? Again, reminding us of that complicated sort of a Soviet history, or torn intentionally or not, where the images becomes recontextualized from its origins. Here's one more that I found, colorized portrait of a Mamedjian family. Again, I don't know if the image here was cut out for the purposes of remembrance, of preservation, because these people are no longer there. It was impossible for me to trace, and I'm sure somebody has answers out there, but I wasn't necessarily interested in the answers. I was interested in what I, as somebody coming to the archive, find in them, and which sort of in which connections I can draw, especially with the images that I saw elsewhere. Sort of that history of it. There's the sense of, to give you, of TASS archive, right? Which in a sense has many sort of a loose ends, and this is an example of one of them, right? This is a 1905 image that says a Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, which is which is essentially not true, right? A documentary archival photography here is actually a still from a Soviet movie, Девятое января, where an image from one sort of from a movie or a film becomes representative of a moment in history, or at least is passed as that. So in my own work, just to throw back, I do a lot of this. I do a lot of revision. I do a lot of disruption of some of these historical images that are constructs and impossible spaces. And one of them, here's an example of Viktor Oreshniko's painting, Staff Planning the Defense of Petrograd, November 1917, which is an impossible space, even though it physically exists, but the Stalin and Lenin would have never been there at the same time in 1917. So what I do is I take those spaces and I empty them of the context. I empty them of the sort of events that are depicted and constructed for the purposes of deception. There's Lenin and Smolny, 1930. Even though Lenin it's painted in 1930, right? Lenin is dead in since 1924. The image is obviously done or constructed from a number of existing photographs. And again, in that sort of same fashion, I empty these spaces and return them to this sort of deprive them of that referent, of that index. I also worked on some on objects and sort of in that similar fashion, where in the events when Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia, sort of went out on his adventures, quote unquote, in a search for publicity and certain recognition, where I would again try to remove objects from their context or from their sort of a conscription for misinformation and deception. And I would have these objects reproduced, and I would essentially at that point have them in my possession, symbolically taking them away from that event. Again, when monuments of Stalin started returning to Russian towns, in this sort of a sad turn of events, I sort of reconstructed some of them, and again in an attempt to sort of comment on how this is a return, a symbolic return to something in history that is very painful, and yet we're forgetting about it. In some other images, right, some of the earlier my work, I've always looked at these collective images done for the sake of propaganda. Here are some images from classrooms, and then sort of when in 2007, photographing in Russia, I would often visit schools and sort of look at how spaces still continue to inhibit and continue to sort of perpetuate some of this construct, some of these sort of arrangements, and obviously the faces of leaders, and where veterans from the war would be returned to school to remind people of atrocities and the consequences of World War II, and then sort of again return some of these and comment on the unconstructed nature of some of these events and encounters, how the walls, in a sense, of buildings, in a sense, embody some of these history and some of these memories that should probably be forgotten and erased, but that in my mind is something that Russia hasn't dealt with, and I was observing it by photographing it regularly. In the project archive, I sort of saw some of these things from the here's some images from 1935 and 1950s. Again, the monuments of the monument of Lenin, and then a picture of Lenin, if you can see on a picture on the right, hanging in a domestic space. And again, the origin of that image is also sort of questionable to me, because from what I could gather, it was also done for the sake of possibly propaganda. There's one more. There's some of my images where I actually sort of document and collect. Often encounter people on the streets. Some of my early work. Again, take an interest in the spaces, right? Sort of reflecting on how that space, and in the sense, contributes possibly to collective, to the perception of how the space is embodied in what is being placed into it. And then again, I would be, going through the archive, I would be finding some of these sort of very interesting, again, just purely visual connections. But I was wondering how and why, in some ways, I would come across and connect some of these things. And here's, here's a Weaver executed plans by 120%, right? So in this sense, maybe some of the answers here for me lay in some sort of his early history of the Soviet Union, when photography itself was essentially conscripted to the purposes of, in a sense, of propaganda, right? If we take Vertov's manifesto of 1919, which was essentially titled "We," he would say that our path is from dwaddling students via the poetry of a machine to a perfect electric man, a new man freed from the weight and clumsiness, whose exact and light movements of the machine will become a useful object for filming. The goal of photomontage, and he speaks of film, but in a sense, film and photography are closely connected for some of the Soviet theoreticians early on. And photography is an easy tool to be conscripted for some of these purposes, to creating a collective image of change and disruption, and where people are turned more into sort of objects of history, right? Where their likeness is used not sort of for the sake of memory or individual memory, but actually as a sense sort of for the purposes of creating some kind of a collective vision of the future, right? And the goal of the photo montage is essentially sort of used for producing meaning stripped of all ambiguity, ideological, semantical. Tendency of 1920s and 30s photography, Soviet photography, was sort of the non-artistic production made for mass consumption, rather than for museums and archives. So often what would happen is that images would be discarded and thrown away before, after the montage was accomplished. And so this image was very interesting to me because I recognized sort of that image was done for the sake of the propaganda and sort of for those very reasons. But what I've noticed, and if you look directly above the head of this woman, you'll notice that there's a fingerprint that is somehow sort of recorded in the emulsion of the image itself. And that sort of was a later part of my working with an archive, was I started sort of trying to connect again with the extended or was the other side of this image. What is this image really sort of meant after its life? Because that hand, somebody handled this, right? And that fingerprint is actually representing somebody else or somebody who was a part of this experience. Maybe that image was not dear to someone because it was done for the sake of propaganda, but on the other hand, it also bears this sort of the individual imprint. So collective and individual is married in that image for me. These images were interesting because sort of some of those, I found some duplicates that had slightly varying inscriptions or captions. So they were obviously may have been used for different purposes or in different archives initially. But again, sort of how an individual is the image no longer serves the purposes of some kind of a memory or a record of an individual, but it is conscripted for collective, for something else. Here's a few other, these are sort of would be a typical propaganda images done again to be used in publications or for propaganda posters. And often what would happen, here's one more, is they often would be sort of removed from the context or the background and then pasted and placed into posters and other publications, again sort of in the tradition of the Soviet photo montage. So again, these images to me were sort of this disembodied, removed from its original context. We no longer know who that is. We know sort of a function in some ways. We know their name, but they're there to function as sort of as a cog, as some kind of as a symbolic image to construct, right? To construct collective memory in some ways, and historical narratives. And here's a few more, right? And sort of when I was looking at these images, I sort of, again, I was coming across, I started looking at some other archives in addition, and I started thinking, and this was my sort of a latest direction, is where I really got interested sort of in more of a social photographs or images that come from family archives, and somehow visually connected me to the images that I just looked at. And I returned again to the tear and to the fragmentation. And because the surface of the image is, again, was not connecting me to the, apologies, my timer, to the families or to the people that are depicted in them. But what I saw in these lines and tears and these creases is actually, I realized that that's how I connect to this archive, and that's how I can, in a sense, through material culture of these images, because I realized that this image may have been bent or folded for the purposes of being carried or stored in the pocket or in the wallet or somewhere else, or transported somewhere, right? Maybe just like these photographs where you'll notice that the creases in the images are fairly similar, as to accommodate some kind of a container that may have housed them for somebody who cared about either these people, maybe have about these people. And I sort of started looking and finding more images that would have fingerprints in them, or again, something that would, in a sense, remind me of the object that this photograph actually functions, right? And this would extend these images to me in a much more complex narratives and complex, because I could connect to them on the human level. And essentially, again, I returned to some of the older images, and I started looking specifically images that exhibited tears and and breaks. And I started thinking, why do they have them? Just because the emulsion cracked? Maybe at what point did this happen? Were they folded in order to be stored and carried with someone who cared for these images? Because some of these images may have survived because somebody cared about these images, and because they brought them and put them in their pocket or in their purse, in their pockets, in their handbags, and so on and so forth. And sort of I started, again, this is a very small representation, but I was finding more and more sort of images and looking specifically for images that were not mended, that exhibited some of these creases and tears where they may have been folded or to accommodate somebody's body. They were, to me, directly connected to the body. So anyways, again, that's all that I have. Ardo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pavel. Thank you so much. It's such a there's so much to talk about it. I one of the things I love is that you our archive at Project Save is so vast. I'm so happy and excited that with you being here, it's exactly what I was hoping for. That you unearthed photographs, and now we're sharing photographs that it could very well be we really haven't shared before. Not everything has been digitized, not everything is on our website. It's a tremendous amount of work, and there's a lot of backlog of work.
Well, it is, in some way, this is a very different way for me of thinking for me. So again, yes. I think I'm still connecting these things, and that's probably why some of these ideas feel probably disjointed, but somewhere there, I'm sort of trying to connect again. I'm trying to offer an opportunity for this archive to have broader sort of connection points, right?
Yeah,
For
yeah.
anybody, and not just based on some kind of a cultural affiliation as well, which I
Sure,
think would be
sure.
great for any archive. Yeah.
Sure, sure. And as a way to connect to what you just said, I did want to, I feel like I didn't quite explain. I would like people to understand the purpose of these residencies. So the idea behind the residencies is as follows. Every year, starting with Pavel as our inaugural artist in residence, Project Save will be having 2 artists in residence and 2 researchers in residence. The artists could be photographers, sculptors, musicians, what have you. Researchers could be writers, educators, curators, conservators, other archivists, possibly, things like that. And the purpose, why are we doing this? The purpose, other than uh, re-energizing and opening up the archive and really putting the archive on the map, which is where it should be, as a really important photography archive. Part of it is exactly a lot of what Pavel, you talked about today. The idea of that you weren't sure, and might feel a little disjointed. In other words, that was exactly my hope. That I feel that by inviting people like you to be residents, there's a whole new perspective on the material in our archives. There are new questions. There's new kind of points of entry, and I think that's very important because I've always been averse. I have an uneasy relationship with when an institution or a concept becomes a little bit caught in a kind of, ethnic kind of loop or echo chamber. I feel that that's a problem because then it's really the same people talking to each other in a very constricted type of discourse. So what happens is then a lot of things are being left out. There's a lot of questions that aren't being asked. There are new ways of seeing things. And there's even a kind of playfulness. The fact that you are looking at images, or our other residents that we invite, they might be looking at these images as well and not be really sure what the context is exactly. But in a way, for me, that's the point, because then there's this jarring effect that loosens things up and allows for a little bit of different approaches, playfulness, imagination, and different types of questions. There are a number of questions here that people are dying to ask you. Before I get to them, I wanted to kick things off with asking you, I think somewhere in your talk, you mentioned an idea of control, if I'm not mistaken. You mentioned control a couple of times. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I think that's a really important, that really hasn't come up before in this series of talks that we've had. And I think that's really interesting. Because I was thinking, yeah, there is a sense of control. Obviously, archives are trying to, consciously or subconsciously, they're trying to organize, they're trying to describe, there is a little bit of direct or indirect control of memory, or of how we think about things or remember things or categorize things. How does that work for you? Or what is it that you noticed either in our archives at Project Save or in your own work? How does that idea of control resonate?
I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to remember the moment in which I would have mentioned the control.
Yeah, sorry, I tried to write it
speaking of
down.
controlling. I think archive in itself sets up a structure, right? Or is a system. And then actually that's something that I didn't read my talk entirely. I was trying to but one of the things that is Jacques Derrida actually wrote in Archive Fever, the technical structure of the archive. Archiving archive also determines the structure of the archivable content, even if in its relationship to the future. The archivization produces as much as it records the event.
Mhm.
So I think through archiving, and is what you're saying, offering the archive to somebody else for interpretation, I think you're producing knowledge, right? and that knowledge may have varying outcomes. Again, you never know who's able to connect what.
Right.
So if that's what you're, am I answering your question?
Yeah, kind of. I think I'm starting to remember now. I think you mentioned control partly in the point where you were talking about because I was going to connect that to this idea of reconstructing, because you're a photographer, but you're also taking images and then reconstructing them
Right.
through using different materials and so forth. So is there something there about trying to take some kind of ownership of memory or belonging or
Certainly.
something
Yes.
like that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I sort of, as I demonstrated, I think I was hoping to demonstrate that was that image that I found in your archive of the Stalin walking, right? And then that I had to go and actually, find three sources of that image in some ways. And we can always see that there's very little truth in that image, right? Or some kind of objective relationship that we may have. Because, and I think Soviets has done this, right? I mean, actually to this day, it happens. I think some of the authoritarian sort of regimes built themselves on this sense of forgetting, right? I mean, you can't build this sort of a socioeconomic utopia without sort of making everybody else forget.
Yeah.
Because then you can remind them, it's like, well, we need to, because then you can just build it forever. So I think
Right.
at some point when I started doing some of this work that you're seeing, which is sort of a guide to collective melancholy is actually at some point I realized that I keep seeing the same images in the history books and and so on and so forth, because there was a limited number of images that were just conscripted for various purposes, sometimes altered and sometimes not, and just reused over and over and over again. And that's how you sort of build this sense of that everybody recognizes this. We're all singing to the same tune, we're looking at the same images, and we have the same reference. So I started sort of taking these images and recontextualizing them, right? Symbolically. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of a revisionist sort of approach, but that was entirely that. Yeah.
Interesting. We have a question here from Tamar. She's asking, as you were working on this project, did the themes and questions that were present reveal other current contexts other than the ones you were directly studying? So for example, the idea of a photo as an item, if it's a digital photo shared on social media. So yeah, I guess like did other contexts reveal themselves other than the ones that were in front of you or that you were initially perceiving? And how might that inform?
Sort of as Tamar, if I'm understanding your question correctly, sort of a photo, digital photo, how does sort of recontextualization of some of these images imbues different meanings or like different meanings?
Yeah, and how might that influence your work, or how are you kind of digesting that, and then is that influencing or informing your time at Project Save? So in other words, your initial interpretation might then morph into something else,
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think partially I sort of realized that my talk, because as I'm looking, I have 9 pages here, it could have been much longer. So I was trying to sort of compress it. And that's why maybe some of these ideas are not clearly communicated. But I mean, that's why I sort of arrived at I returned to the interest in the material properties or the objectness of some of these images, because on one hand, I realized that there's much to be discovered. And some of them is, again, like some of these images are actually, we often forget that a photograph is not just the surface and what's depicted there, right? But there's actually the object that has direct relationship to the body. We carry them, we put them away, we store them, we cry over them, we pull them out to remember sort of certain things. We talk about them, we share them with somebody else. I mean, and we take them with us wherever we go. And I think digital has really changed that in some ways. This is how I came, because I started realizing I'm looking at the same images, both digitally as an objects in your archive. And I realized that digital archive removes that objectness completely. I no longer have a sense of size. I don't know how that surface reflects the light. I don't know, I can't tell exactly sort of some of these properties just disappeared. That thing is abstracted. It's no longer the object. And so that duality is very interesting to me, but that's sort of led me to thinking about how some of these images actually carry this complex context and history of how exchange of hands, exchange of sort of a preservation of memory, right? Memento moris, these objects of intense sort of a longing and a connection to a place or a person that they may have represented, or completely the context is removed. And now here we are sort of trying to reestablish some of that context.
Right.
And some of it is very charged, right? I mean, some of these images, again, from Ottoman Empire, right? In some ways, I mean, they're loaded with that sort of a history, that context, with that trauma and tragedy, right?
Yes.
So every crease becomes both metaphorically sort of meaningful and symbolic, possibly, of somebody trying to preserve that image and hastily, stowing it away in the pocket or in the bag or somewhere and carrying it out. So we forget how images meant different things to people 100 years ago, right? Because they may have been only one family picture, and that may have been one of the most important objects in that family.
Right.
Now we don't have that relationship in some way.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's I've talked to, that has come up in almost every one of these talks, is the idea of the materiality of photography, and how, obviously we're living in very different times where, as Tamar mentioned and other people have mentioned before, it's all Instagram, digital, all this stuff, social media, and to the point where I actually, one of the things I've been doing is I'm always, as some people have noticed, but it's important that it turns out that all these years, there were plenty of people that support Project Save, who actually were not truly aware that this is a physical archive. I mean, their minds just immediately assumed, I guess, that this was more of a digital archive. And that's both telling and I mean, it's important. It's important to understand that, these are physical objects, and there is a big difference in preserving the physical object or having a digital copy of it. Digital copies are great for research, for, a presentation like we had today, all things like that. Of course, they're valuable, but that's very different than the physical object. So absolutely, that's it's funny how we relatively quickly, we've all collectively kind of just gone to this digital side where we just assume things are kind of digital, and when they're not, when that materiality is still very, very important. Speaking of the materiality, there's a question here about the images that you construct, with the chairs and the tables and the rooms. And they're asking, how did you construct those images? How did you kind of create that emptiness? What was the method that you used?
Well, I guess the emptiness is more of a both the byproduct of the process, because all the images essentially photographs of miniatures, right? They're constructed out of paper in their entirety, but they're often sort of a direct reference from paintings, photographs, sometimes multiple, both from public archive, personal archive, and so on and so forth. And that's sort of the sense of ownership, right? I sort of work from very simple concepts, and one of them that I mentioned is that, photography was conscripted by Soviet Union and removed from its context of some kind of even though it did exist on a sort of individual level, but it was very quickly sort of conscripted as this art for, in a sense, direct communication, and the way the things were sort of handled, right, for the sake of essentially propaganda, even early on, is where, there would be these photographers that would be regularly sent, and they would collect images, of people working, this, and then the sense of sort of this, a photograph as an object of memory disappears there, because they would be, cut up, used in often photo montages initially, which goes away eventually. But early on, the photography is sort of almost directly is stripped of its sort of its social function. I mean, I guess it's not stripped of its social function, but part of its social contract, in a sense, is rethought or sort of given different purpose. So,
Right.
and in my work, remaking my work, I sort of work from that, right? I take ownership of some of these spaces and historical images, while keeping them as sort of as miniatures made out of paper, and then I destroy the sets because in that same sort of similar fashion, they just exist as images,
Right.
which no longer have their context or original place. Yeah.
Um, and that kind of brings me to another point I wanted to make. You know, we have so many photos at Project Save that are, you mentioned some of these kind of composite photos. They've been altered in some way. And there's a comment here from Armin. Thank you, Armin, for the comment. But just talking about how, you know, it's important to also remember that a photo from 100 years ago itself is a construction. So even if it's altered, even if it's not altered per se, but the fact that a photographer, you know, posed these people in a particular setting, took the photo a certain way. So in other words, the idea of kind of the reality within the photo is, how can we say, you know, it's just an interesting thing to think about, in the sense that, you know, I think of our photographs, a lot of our photographs at Project Save, they're photographs of the photographs themselves. I've come to think of them as objects of witnessing in many ways, right? They're objects of tumultuous periods like the Armenian genocide. They're witnessing survivors, all sorts of political upheaval, the earthquake in Gyumri in '88, Armenian independence, all of the kind of the kind of explosion of dispersion of Armenians globally in the late 19th century into the 20th century, which were often also traumatic kind of migrations. So I think there is something interesting there, where the original photo itself is a kind of a construct in a way. It is capturing a moment in time, a real moment in time, but it is being constructed. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a, you know, again, probably not very clearly, but what sort of I'm trying to make sense of is that, you know, to someone, obviously a photograph, and it's sort of most of these photographs meant something, right? Even to maybe a photo, sort of a photographer that worked for, you know, for one of the sort of publications, right? They use that image. It may have meant something, even in exhibiting their own skill, right? Photographer, as Roland Barthes actually says, right? Photograph is 4 things, as you know, in a sense. What I think of myself, what, you know, one sort of what a photographer thinks of me, and the last one is essentially like what the photographer uses to exhibit his art, right? So, so every photograph is loaded with that original meaning, right? Even if it's not connected to the object or the person that is being depicted. And then, you know, that photograph exchanges hands, it acquires certain meanings. It's sort of that layering happens. And that's why I became interested, again, in these fingerprints and creases, intentional creases, not just, you know, emulsion cracking or whatever it is, but I'm really sort of, to me, materiality is sort of not necessarily adds to the context, but it expands it. Right. The narrative is actually much broader, right? We don't know, but through some historicity, thinking, you know, this photograph that is creased looks like was neatly creased. Again, we don't know this unless we have somebody to tell the story, and we usually don't have a person to tell that story. But we may suggest that somebody really cared about this photograph and wanted to preserve it, and we don't know that, right? But so that adds to the meaning of that photograph, to the context, to the life of this image. And I think we often like, there's this idea of restoring, right? People digitally repair their photographs and so on and so forth, which makes sense. But on the other hand, I feel like the archive's role, such as your archive, is actually, you know, by not mending these images, you're actually expanding the set of meanings that photograph imbues, or that it has. Embodies.
Yeah, and I think the other element that kind of got me thinking about what's popped up for me more and more over this past year is, as you say, not just the materiality of the photo itself, but um, there's a ghost-like element around photographs because someone held those photographs, right?
Mhm.
The people in those photos might have held those photos in their hands. They were in their homes, and then someone else held that photo. Then they took it somewhere else, and it was passed to somebody. So there's this chain of materiality and physicality around the photograph, and I think that's it's generally a kind of for me, a kind of poignant and interesting concept there to think about. But I think it takes a lot of it takes on extra meaning for me to think about, especially among people that are going through some kind of terrible hardship, that they're trying to save these photos, that they're moving from place to place. They might have lost a lot of other things, but they're holding on to these photos in whatever way they can, and then that photo somehow ends up in an archive, and then it ends up being looked at, let's say by yourself or by others. And I think there are layers of yeah, I think you're right. It's a kind of it opens it up. It opens up the photograph
Sure.
beyond the frame of the photo in many
Yeah, it might
ways.
not be helpful to a researcher, right, who's after sort of some kind of objective understanding, or
Right.
not directly, but I think
Right.
as I think this is where maybe artists could speculate about meanings or propose certain sets of meanings, is that because I think for me, I felt like there was a place to ask, well, what if, right,
Right.
or could have been in some ways, right, propose it, because a lot of images that I showed sort of to me actually are imbuing a lot of human drama, a lot of human trauma, actually, specifically, right? Because we don't know, like, just beyond sort of the limitations of human body, we don't know what happened to these people often,
Yes.
or I don't. And
Right.
the captions or the information that's provided with these images don't provide that, don't offer that, right, in
Right.
some ways.
Right.
But the body of the photograph itself, I think, is metaphorically, symbolically, and sometimes directly sort of could reveal parts of that, snippets of that story. So to
Yes.
me, there's great complexity, great sort of it's a human connection to an object, which is not as easy sometimes to do with a retouched photograph or with a digital version of it. And Soviet propaganda done exactly that. It retouched it, sort of a every image of Stalin that you may have seen has been doctored, and
Right.
and there were only a few. If you would have not seen a picture of Stalin unless it was approved, right? Some of these images of propaganda, you could see it in the images in your archive. A lot of them have, they're edited for contrast. The lines are sort of they're retouched heavily, the images themselves. So somebody just wanted sort of erase this idea of a photograph, actually, that is a subject to flaw in some
Right.
ways, an
Right.
object.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as a way to kind of wrap up this evening, and we could go on and on about it. It's so fascinating, all the points that you've brought up, and your images that you shared. I, I think that's exactly right, and you mentioned that also in your talk, that oftentimes you weren't necessarily, as you've been going through a lot of these photographs, I think the way you said it was, I wasn't interested in an answer per se, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that really struck a chord with me, because that's exactly the point. That makes me so happy, because I think what my aim has been with these residencies, with what I hope that will continue with the residencies, is exactly that I think that, researchers have their role, historians, sociologists, that's very valuable work, obviously. But I think that there's a lot to be gained, not just from fresh pairs of eyes, people that might not be so familiar with Armenian culture, Armenian history, and so forth, but also uh, artists, creative folks, who it's not necessarily about getting to a final kind of equation of you see these photographs and there has to be some finality to it, that we can explain everything going on in that context. It's actually the opposite, that it kind of unfolds and opens up, and there's actually I think that's very useful, I feel, especially for groups like Armenians, other kind of other other groups that have gone through tremendous periods of upheaval and trauma and so forth. I think sometimes things can get closed off and fossilized within that collective discourse or lack of discourse, really, about that trauma and about certain events, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Mhm,
It just
mhm.
becomes a loop. And because obviously people are in pain and a lot of that pain is unresolved. So they want answers. They want clear answers. And when that happens, things tend to get reductive and just very black and white and binary and all that stuff. So I think that that's exactly it. That I think archives and especially photography, photographs, are oftentimes, that's the beauty of them. They're places of no answers. That's exactly why we keep returning the photograph. If there was an answer, you wouldn't look at a photograph over and over again. I think the whole point is that there's a kind of mysterious resonance that kind of keeps going, that I think is a valuable thing to be attuned to, and I think that's wonderful that you kind of that you were kind of have been attuned to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of photography is actually through contextual association, right? I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, you can look at, as you mentioned, you can look at the same photograph over and over and over and over again, and sort of, as they say, you never read the same book twice. I think you never look at the same photograph twice the same way either, right? And
Right. Right.
but the more we understand history, the more we understand certain context, and possibly context in which photography was created, existed, and conscripted, right, by on every level, from individuals to sort of certain power structures. It is still often sort of photography is sort of a very sensitive field that often does. We like photographs of ourselves a particular way. We control our likeness through photography all the time.
Right.
We sort of we look at photographs, and we often, I think Roland Barthes again, so I keep returning to him, but he says, right, you show me your photograph, I'll show you yours, right? In some ways,
Right.
it's a dialogue that sort of keeps on happening, and I think an archive is that kind of a dialogue in some ways.
Right.
But what it does, it sort of it opens. There's an infinite number of associations that can happen just simply because of the volume that you possess. And
Right.
also, not all of those images are, in a sense, social images, right? A lot of them are done with particular purpose, for a certain function. So connecting
Right.
these images from individual and personal archives with images that are done for, again, for collective, some kind of a collective purposes with intent, I think is very interesting, has always been interesting to me, like the
Right.
space between collective and personal.
Right.
Because I think they're connected. They're always connected.
Yeah. Yeah. Pavel, thank you so much
Mhm.
for taking the time. Uh, I'd like to remind everyone, first of all, thank you so much to everyone for joining. We're so pleased and humbled that so many people have shown interest in these conversations. A couple of points. At the end of each residency, the resident at that time will kind of take some time to process what they've been thinking about, what they've been working on while they were a resident at Project Save. And then other than doing one of these talks, they'll be kind of creating some kind of original work, whatever that might be, based on their time as a resident. And then we will facilitate a way to share that work with the public. So it might be an exhibit or an installation at a gallery. It might be something virtual. There are all sorts of possibilities. So we're very excited to in the coming months to work with Pavel to then share his creation with all of you based on his time at Project Save. We have a couple, just very quick announcement. We're having our first in-person event. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do this event in person, but we're having our first in-person event December 4th. It's a fundraiser, a holiday party So we're hoping those of you that are in the Massachusetts area, we hope to see you. It'll also be an opportunity. As the new executive director, I haven't really been able to meet people in person. So we thought this is a great opportunity to enjoy the holidays. It's been a crazy couple of years for everyone, everywhere. We're hoping we can come together, reconnect, connect with new people, see old friends. So we're going to share the link with you here. If you're interested, if you're in the Massachusetts area, it'd be wonderful to see you. The details are in the link. Our next conversations on photography will be at the end of January with David Lowe, who's a historian who works on kind of the history of photography and how photography is in dialogue with history and culture. And he has a book that has come out or is about to come out that has to do with photography in the Ottoman Empire. And he used a lot of images from Project Save. So we'll share that information with you all. In the meantime, feel free to check out our new website, projectsave.org. You'll find a lot of information, a lot of images, ways that you can support our mission, or if you're interested in donating your photographs, you can find all the information there. And if you want to be in touch, please feel free to do so through the website. We thank you all very much. Pavel, thank you so much. This was really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you for the opportunity. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Also, I want to quickly thank my team, by the way, to Margaret Eckstein, our assistant archivist and administrative assistant, our archivist, Marta Fodor, and of course, our founder, Ruth Tomasyan, without whom we wouldn't be doing any of this. So thank you to them very much. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful night and have a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Otto. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.